This is National Educational Television, a program distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center.
Hi. Someone has put Canadian history into a neat capsule formula, from fish to furs to furrows. This was some years ago. I think today that this formula probably should be revised in order to include oil derricks and Geiger counters. But we're not going to argue about that today. I'm going to have all I can do in the time available to take you from fish to furs. Now, Frenchmen actually became interested in the Americas long before, or some years before, there was any official interest on the part of the Crown. But we'll see that story in just a moment. Let's follow through the various steps of the so-called official interest. The Crown of France, Francis I, in 1524, finally decided that he better have somebody look in on this world that the Spaniards were beginning to talk so much about. And in that year, he sent an Italian who was in his employ, Giovanni Verrazzano, to give the North American coastline the once-over. And Verrazzano ran it from somewhere, possibly around in the Carolinas, it's not too definite, on up to the Bay of Fundy. And it's on his claims, or the claims that he made at that time, that France bases her rights in the New World. A decade later, in 1534, Francis decides to send a Frenchman out to do some exploring. This is the famous Jacques Cartier of Saint-Malo. Cartier, on this first voyage, was commissioned to attempt to find a northwest passage. Now, actually, when he got up into this region, he found that his way was blocked by the icebergs and slipped back and discovered the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. Now, he didn't discover the St. Lawrence River at this time. He thought that this was just a considerable indentation of the coast. He went back and reported, and what he had seen was of sufficient interest that in the next year, Francis sent him back again. Now, it's on this occasion, in 35, that he decides to push on back into what he considers this inlet, this Gulf of the St. Lawrence, and he discovers the mouth of the river and follows it upward as far as Montreal. He's blocked by the rapids, the so-called the Sheen Rapids, which are a little bit to the south of Montreal. During this particular voyage, he picked up a certain amount of rumor about a rich kingdom that was supposed to exist somewhere in the north, the kingdom of Saguenay. And though things were in something of a turmoil back home, nevertheless, Francis I began to think of the possibilities of running down the rumors. After all, remember that it was only a few years before that the Spaniards had run down a rumor and had found Mexico. And they'd run down another rumor and had found Peru. Maybe Saguenay would be as rich, maybe even richer, the Frenchmen hoped, than these jackpots that the Spaniards had hit. In the 1540s, 1542, Jacques Cartier came out and wintered near the site of the future Quebec. The winter was very severe, and when spring came and the supply expedition had not showed up, they packed up and decided to go on back to France. They got out here in the Gulf, and the supply expedition under Roberval was coming along, but they said, if you kids want to go through one of these Canadian winters, you're welcome to it. We're going home where we can get warm. The Roberval venture lasted one winter, and it failed. Now, for the moment, that closes the official French interest in the North. However, in the decade of the 60s, there were two French attempts to found colonies down here along the, on the Georgia, or I should say, yeah, I'm right, on the Georgia-Florida shoreline. These two failed. A decade before, the Frenchmen had tried their hand down in South America and for a time held Rio de Janeiro. But all of these failed. Now, then France got herself involved in a rather serious fracas at home, the Wars of the Religion. And down to the end of the century, official French interest more or less lagged. However, Frenchmen were preparing for the future French Empire in North America. And these Frenchmen were the fishermen. Now, when Cabot had come over in 1497 and had run along the northeastern section of the North American coast, he had not found much that was promising, but he and his men returned and they told fish stories. And these happened to be true fish stories. They had actually touched the so-called Grand Banks of Newfoundland. And they told, and they were not exaggerating, how they could dip a bucket, dip a basket into the sea and come up with a whole basket full of fish. Now, always remember this, that in the 16th century, fish is very important in the European diet. It's important because there is insufficient meat, and it's also important because a great portion of Europe eats fish on Friday and eats fish several weekdays during the Lenten season. So there's always a tremendous market. And this fishing enterprise was one of the more highly developed industries of most of the Western European nations. So as soon as this word gets around, that there's fish by the bucketful, just for reaching down, fishermen from all over Western Europe, Dutchmen and Walloons and Flemings and people from the Scandinavian countries, Englishmen, Scotsmen, Irishmen, Spaniards, Frenchmen, and so on, begin to flock out to the banks. Now, in the early stages, they carried on with a technique that is known as green fishing. They let down their nets, made their catch, and then took their catch on home. As time went on, some of them decided, okay, we're close enough to land here. Why don't we land in certain spots, dry our fish, and then we can pack them, and we can take home half again, maybe once again, as many as we could by this so-called green method. This is the so-called dry method. Now, when they do that, here's what happens. They have drying stations. They don't form settlements as yet, but they have drying stations along Newfoundland and along the coast here. They come back to these each year. Now, this puts them in contact with the Indians. And the Indians watch the fishermen as they set up their apparatus for drying, and they are amazed. It's the Indians' first contact with the white man's ironware. They watch him, and they see a chap take an instrument. It's much like their axes, and with 2 or 3 deft blows, he can fell a sapling, a few more, he can fell a tree, then he can cut it up. The Indians say, ugh, ugh, take us many days with these instruments, good instruments white man got. So, you know what happens then. Then they begin to say, a gun. What you take for those instruments? Well, the white man looks over what they have to offer, a few seashells and things like that, and he said, nope, not interested, no bargain here. And then he suddenly gets the idea, maybe we can take the shirts off the Indians' backs. The Indians were clothed in furs, and these fishermen see the possibility of taking those furs and marketing them in Europe. And the fur trade is born. Here's the step from fish to furs. Now, little by little, as these fishermen come back to those drying stations, they bring a certain number of trade goods, a few hatchets, a few axes, maybe a kettle or two, some beads, looking glasses, steel points, and the Indians are waiting for them. This time they don't have to take the shirts off their backs. They have these stacks of pelts that they have gathered during the winter, and a brisk trade develops. Now, at first, the fur trade was a sideline with the fishers. But then, little by little, some of the fishers say, ye gods, we're making more money on the furs than we are on the fish. Why don't we go into it whole hog? And so they do. And little by little, you have the interest growing in the fur trade. Now, it's on this interest in the fur trade and on the basis of those early contacts which these fishermen have made that France is going to try to build an empire. Toward the end of the 16th century, things settle down in France, and Henry IV finally emerges as the French monarch. And he has desires to have an empire. Here's this nationalism that's beginning to work again, just as Richard Hakluyt needled the English. If the Spaniards can have an empire, why can't we have an empire? The same type of thinking prevails as far as Henry IV is concerned. He is bound and determined that La Belle France is going to have an empire, and it's going to be a grander empire, more extensive and so on than the miserable, despicable Spaniards have. And the first grants, the first patents are given. Now, in general, they're given to individuals, and these individuals have the right of monopolizing the fur trade, but in return, they are supposed to introduce settlers. Now, few of them do, and the patent changes hands a number of times. However, in 1608, the patentee, a man by the name of de Monts, employs the man who is to be the great Frenchman in the North American story, Champlain. Champlain has been out there before. Champlain has done some exploring and comes up and founds Quebec in 1618 on the St. Lawrence. This becomes the capital. Now, Champlain is a great American. Champlain has a number of interests. What he wants principally is not merely gain. He wants France to have a glorious empire. Now, he knows that it's going to have to be built upon the fur trade. And he also knows that once he is settled here in the valley, he's going to have to ally himself with the Indians of the valley, the Algonquin, the Huron, the Ottawa, as his fur gatherers. Now, what he doesn't realize at the time is this. When he makes that alliance, he is taking one side of a forest feud that had been going on for a number of years before. The Huron-Algonquin-Ottawa combination had been feuding with the Iroquois peoples who are down here in what is now Upper New York. And Champlain is pulled into this fight. Now, that is going to have very serious consequences for New France as time develops. And the Iroquois, as we'll see presently, are going to cause a great deal of trouble and practically ruin the French enterprise. Champlain, however, wants to build solidly. He wants the fur trade regulated so that irresponsible traders will not come out and mess up the fine relations that he is able to build with the Indians. he also wants to do something for the Indians. And on one of his many trips to France, in 1815, or returning from one of his many trips to France, in 1615, he brings back the first missionaries, a group of recollects. These are the gray robes. 10 years later, they find that the job is too big for the number of men that they can bring over, and they invite the black robes, the Jesuits, to come in. Champlain, in the meantime, has also been doing a considerable amount of exploration and has brought to the knowledge of Frenchmen some knowledge of Lake Ontario and some knowledge of Lake Huron. Then, about the time that everything is getting pretty well under control, ill fortune hits New France. The Englishmen, who are at war with France in this particular instance, sanction an expedition, and a family, a Scotch family by the name of Kirk, Jarvis Kirk and his sons, get an expedition together, and they surprise the French, capture Quebec, and turn the French out. This English interlude lasts for 3 years. Then, by that time, the French diplomats have gotten to work, and remember that one of the greatest of the French diplomats, or one of the greatest diplomats in French history, Cardinal Richelieu, is at the helm, and they outmaneuver the English and win back Canada, and in 1632, the Frenchmen return. Now, for about 10 years after that, New France knows a period of considerable prosperity. It's a period when the fur trade booms, and they begin to work farther and farther out. They explore farther. For example, during that period, several of the explorers, in this instance, they happen to be groups of Jesuit missionaries, discovered Superior, discovered the Sioux, they discovered Erie. One of his young men, les jeunes, as Champlain called them, Jean Nicolet, it goes out in 1634 in search of to run down the rumor of a saltwater sea. There's a very interesting thing in this whole French story. They continue to be obsessed with the idea that maybe the Pacific Ocean is not too far away, and any inkling of salt water, they are willing to run it down, because the French are still thinking of the possibility of some sort of a quick route whereby they can muscle into, if you will, the trade with the Indies. Nicolet comes out, and he discovers the Straits of Mackinac, pushes on down, and ends up at Green Bay. Here at the end of Green Bay, one of the inlets of Lake Michigan. Now, it's Nicolet who seems first to have picked up the rumor of the great river of the interior. Why he didn't follow it up, nobody has been able to explain, but actually he didn't. He brought the information back, and as we'll see subsequently, this great river of the interior has a drawing power which will pull the French into mid-continent in the latter part of the 17th century. Also during this interlude of peace, you have one of the very interesting mission experiments in North America. The Jesuits move out here, and along the shores of Georgian Bay. Georgian Bay is connected with Lake Huron. Along the shores of Georgian Bay, they try to set up a number of Indian villages in which they can train the Indians in Christianity, train the Indians in the arts of civilization and the like, much as their Spanish brethren were doing in the famous reductions of Paraguay. Now, as I say, things are looking good. There's a fair amount of prosperity. But there are dark clouds on the horizon. And the dark clouds are in the form of the Iroquois. Now, remember what we said last week. The Dutch are on the Hudson. Now, the Iroquois they were enemies of the French. And for the moment, the Indian friends of the French, the Algonquin, the Huron, the Ottawa, and so on, were in a position that they could get the white man's goods and trade those goods into the interior. The Iroquois wanted to catch or to grab hold of that position of middlemen. They didn't want to catch it to take the furs themselves, but they were perfectly willing to sit in the middle, use the white man's goods, and then have these western tribes bring the furs to them. Then they'd haggle with the western tribes. Then, when they had made a profit, then they'd go down, go into Albany or someplace like that, and haggle with the Dutch. Now, when the Dutch hit the Hudson, the Iroquois also have a source of the white man's goods. So there's something of a fight between the Indian friends of the French, the Indian friends of the Dutch, for the trade of the West. And this fight was going to be carried on not according to any peaceful principles. It was going to be deathly competition, and the emphasis is upon deathly, cutthroat competition. In other words, it would be much more cut-scalp competition than cutthroat competition. But at any rate, the Iroquois decide, okay, we must eliminate our competitors. And in the 40s, about the middle 40s, they begin to whittle down the Ottawa. Once they have the Ottawa pretty well under control, then they turn their attention to the Hurons and the Algonquins. The Hurons, they find very conveniently gathered by the Jesuit missionaries out in Huronia, and they swoop down on the Huronia settlements, 48, 49, and 50, and completely scatter the Hurons. Then they're in position to move against the French themselves and the Algonquin Montagnais groups of the valley. Now, the decade of the 50s is a period of severe crisis. And there are several elements that help the French over the hump. However, one should be noted. Earlier in the 40s, just at the tag end of the era of prosperity, a number of Frenchmen had come out, and they had occupied a site upriver, the site of Montreal. And during these hard times, Montreal stands as an outpost and as a bulwark against the Iroquois raids. But the people of Montreal and the Frenchmen and the Indian allies take a terrific beating. Midway through the decade, there is a period of truce. The Iroquois ask for it. And their reasons are rather interesting. Their manpower supply was dwindling. Now, it's perfectly true that they didn't have great losses on each campaign. But when you take an initial manpower reserve, which is not very great, and you whittle away maybe 12, 15, 20, 25 each year of your braves, little by little, your effectives are, well, they're not at their best. So what they needed to do was to catch their breath and try to recruit. Now, their idea of recruiting was to move out among the western tribes to the south of the lakes and try to capture likely individuals, then incorporate them into the tribe. During this period of truce, they even fooled the French to the extent of asking to have the Jesuits sent down among them to found a mission. And they did. The mission, of course, was not successful because the Iroquois in general were not sincere. When they felt that their manpower was sufficiently strong, then in 1660 they planned a campaign of annihilation. There were going to be two movements. One was to come down the Ottawa. One was to come out of Lake Champlain here. They were to converge and take Montreal and then sweep down the river and take Quebec and kill off all their enemies. They were blocked in this. And in the next years, the complexion of things begins to change. In 1661, young Louis XIV has become the king in France. And Louis XIV is a proud individual. He wants, he has something of this same idea that his grandfather Henry IV had. He wants France to have an empire of which she can be proud. So they come to the right person and tell him, look, sire, this enterprise in North America is on the verge of collapse. And they hit him from all sides. The Jesuit superior writes an account of the situation, which is really heartbreaking. A former governor just back comes and reports and shows the difficulties. Then the people themselves send a representative, Pierre Boucher, send him over, and he all this intelligence adds up to one thing: unless you do something and do it quickly, France will have to get out of North America. The Indians, no European rival, but the Indians will drive us out. And in '63, Louis XIV decides to take the colony under his royal patronage, and he appoints a royal governor, a royal intendant, sends royal troops. And '63 is a turning point in the story of New France. She will last for almost a century more with a fair measure of success, even though in the end the French will be bested and ousted by the English. But here's the story in North America of moving from fish to furs. Let's take a quick look at a couple books. You might, this is a fascinating story, and you might want to follow it through. Probably the most thorough of the studies available now is a two-volume work, The Rise and Fall of New France, by George M. Wrong. This is very readable. Then in our rather familiar series, The Chronicles of America, William B. Monroe gives you the Crusaders of New France. It's in shorter compass, but like all the books in this series, very, very readable. At this point, let me call attention to a similar series on Canadian history, specifically on Canadian history. It's called The Chronicles of Canada. And the first 6 or 7 of these books have to do with the French period. Here, just as an example, I have Colby's study of Champlain, the founder of New France. You can read it quite easily, extremely enjoyable. You'll have a hard time putting it down. Now, here's a book that covers somewhat more than the French. I've rather saved it, however. It's Herbert Ingram Priestley, The Coming of the White Man. Now, you'll find something on the Dutch, on the Spaniards, and on the French in this book. Delightfully written, the first volume in another series, which we will call upon in our suggested readings from time to time, A History of American Life. This is volume 1, The Coming of the White Man. Now, we've got everybody on the stage. Very soon, you're going to have the interaction of these actors, and that is the first part of that story we'll tell in hours of next week. So until then, don't spend too much time reading history because you've got other things to do, fascinating as it is. See you.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.